Whisperbound. Episode 5: Shelter and Shadows. The group moved through the jagged ruins, their steps muffled by a thick layer of dust and debris. The child in Eve's arms had fallen back into an uneasy silence, and only the soft rustling of clothing and the crunch of rubble beneath their feet broke the oppressive quiet. Behind Eve walked a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a watchfulness that did not fade even in exhaustion, along with a young man who stayed close to her. After a while, Eve stopped and turned toward them. Her eyes studied the two newcomers, who had only recently joined their group. "I have not asked your names yet," she said, her voice calm but attentive. The young man looked first at Eve, then at the woman beside him, before answering hesitantly. "I am Finn. And this is Clara." His voice was quiet, almost as though he feared that speaking their names might place another burden upon them. "Finn and Clara," Eve repeated, as though she wanted to anchor the names safely in her memory. "Good. Then welcome to the group, if our little circle can be called that." She gave Kael, who stood silently at the side, a brief glance, but he said nothing. Garrick, however, nodded to them and muttered something that sounded like a rough but honest welcome. The group continued their path through the broken ruins. Clara, now clearly recognizable as Finn's older sister, stayed attentively near him. "Where are they leading us?" Finn finally whispered, his voice barely more than breath. Clara gave him a brief look before answering quietly. "No one knows that exactly. But we are here because we have no choice. Or do you think we could simply turn back?" Her words carried a sharp undertone that made Finn flinch. He lowered his gaze and said nothing more. Yet inside him raged a storm of questions. Why had he joined this group? Why had Clara taken him with her when they had left their old hiding place? Eve was strong, he could see that, and brave. Yet she was also a mystery he could not penetrate. Finn admired her, though he could not say exactly why. Perhaps it was her determination, perhaps the way she protected the child as if it were the most precious thing still left in this crumbling city. Kael, on the other hand, stirred something different in him. Fascination, yes, but also something darker. Finn could not help casting furtive glances at Kael again and again, though he wanted to uncover a secret deliberately hidden behind silence. The man's cool distance unsettled him, and yet it drew him in. Kael remained a riddle made of silence, coldness, and hidden experience, and Finn felt the dangerous desire to discover what lay behind that calm. Clara suddenly stopped, her arm moving protectively in front of Finn. "What is it?" he whispered. "Do you hear that?" she asked back. A soft, rhythmic dripping could be heard from the darkness ahead of them. It was a harmless sound, and yet it made the air around them feel heavier. Clara straightened her shoulders. "Stay close to me." Finn knew that her words were not merely a precaution. Since they had joined the group, Clara had always stayed at his side, an unshakable wall between him and anything that might come too close. She was his sister, his protector, ever since they had lost everything years ago. He still remembered clearly the night when the fog had driven them from their home. Clara had grabbed his hand and forced him to run, though his legs could barely carry him from fear. She had dragged him through the terror until they had found shelter in the darkness. Now it was different. Finn was no longer a child, and he hated that Clara still treated him as one. Yet he did not dare tell her so. Not now, when everything was more uncertain than ever. His gaze wandered to Eve, who was speaking quietly with Garrick. She seemed to have so much control over the situation, and Finn wished he could appear that way too, strong enough not to flinch at every sound, and fearless enough not to depend constantly on Clara's protection. Yet as soon as that thought took shape, he felt ashamed of it, because he knew Eve was afraid as well, and was simply better at carrying it. "You were staring," Clara said quietly, and Finn's head snapped around. "I am doing no such thing," he muttered, but she only gave him a knowing smile. "Be careful, Finn. She's not like us, and Kael certainly is not." "What do you mean?" he asked. Clara hesitated before answering. "They are seekers. People like them draw the darkness toward them because they fight it. But we only want to survive. Do not forget that." Finn fell silent, but her words echoed inside him. Was that really true? Was Eve so different from them? He knew Clara wanted to protect him, yet he could not shake the gnawing feeling that her view of the world was too small for what was coming. The child in Eve's arms suddenly stirred, and everyone stopped. A soft murmur escaped her lips, an eerie, barely understandable word. Clara pulled Finn closer to herself, her eyes wide with fear. "That child will lead us to our deaths," she whispered. Finn wanted to contradict her, but he could not, because deep inside, he wondered whether she might be right. The memory of their past seemed to rest on Clara and Finn's shoulders as an invisible weight while they moved through the ruins. The silence around them, broken only by occasional dripping or the crunch of rubble, made the ghosts of the past feel all the more alive. Clara could not drive away the images of that one night. The fog had come silently, unstoppable and cold, swallowing street after street. She had felt the moisture on her skin before she heard the whispering, an uncanny murmur that echoed deep within her. It had been Finn who woke her. Back then he had still been a child, barely able to understand what was happening. But she knew they had no time. She had grabbed his hand and run with him through the dark streets, which suddenly seemed foreign and distorted. The screams of those swallowed by the fog still haunted her to this day. "Clara?" Finn's quiet voice tore her from her thoughts. He walked close beside her, his eyes searching her face. "What?" she asked, her voice sharper than intended. Finn flinched slightly, but said nothing. She sighed. "I am sorry. What did you want to say?" Finn hesitated. "Do you think the fog will ever leave us alone?" Clara stopped, her steps faltering. She looked at him for a long time before she answered. "The fog leaves no one alone, Finn. It takes everything you love and gives nothing back. You know that." Her words were hard, but she could not lie. They had already lost too much. Finn nodded, though he felt the weight of her words squeeze his heart. He thought of the nights they had spent in abandoned houses, of the moments when the fog had drifted past the windows while they hid behind makeshift barricades. Each time Clara had assured him that they were safe, but in her eyes he had seen the fear. "Do you remember the old healing house?" Finn suddenly asked. Clara flinched, and the thought of it made her throat go dry. "Of course I remember," she said quietly. "I thought we would not make it." The healing house had been one of the most dangerous places they had ever had to cross. They had sought refuge, but horror had followed them. Finn remembered flickering candlelight, empty corridors and shadows moving along the walls as though they had a will of their own. Clara had pushed him into a cupboard and ordered him to stay quiet while she, armed with a rusty iron pipe, fought whatever had broken out of the darkness. "You were so calm," Finn said. "I thought you were not afraid." Clara shook her head, a bitter smile on her lips. "I was terrified, Finn, but I could not afford to show you that. You were all I had." Finn looked at her, and a new respect for his sister grew in him. Yet at the same time he felt the pressure that must have rested on her, and the guilt that he had not been able to protect her. "We survived it," he said at last, as though he wanted to remind them both that despite everything, they were still here. Clara nodded, but she said nothing. The memories were too heavy to put into words. The group stopped briefly to rest. Eve gently laid the child on the ground and checked whether she was breathing. Garrick whispered quietly with Kael, and Clara watched them from the corner of her eye. She felt the tension between them, an unspoken burden connecting them all. Finn sat beside her, staring at his hands and seeming lost in thought. Clara placed a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever happens, Finn, we will get through it. Like always." She tried to sound confident, but deep inside she wondered how much longer they could endure. The Healing House. The name alone made Clara's stomach tighten as she set her steps over the dusty ground of the ruins. The thought of it was a thorn lodged deep within her, painful, but so old that she had learned to live with it. Yet today it seemed to drive itself deeper, seemed to twist and tear with every step she took. Finn had asked whether she remembered. Of course she remembered. How could she ever forget? It had not been the fog that had found them back then in that abandoned healing house. It had been people. People who perhaps once had not been very different from them, but desperation and hunger had transformed them into something cruel, something vile, that Clara still could not drive from her thoughts. She had never corrected Finn's false version of the events, the one he had apparently shaped for himself. The thought that he wanted to believe it had been a creature of the fog was bearable to her, a story easier to carry. It had been on the third night, when they had barricaded themselves in one of the upper floors. The fog had not entered, but its presence still seemed to permeate everything. Finn had been hardly more than a boy then, just old enough to understand that the world around them lay in ruins. Clara had promised him they were safe, that no one would find them there. But she had been wrong. It had been the middle of the night when she heard the first thud in the corridor. A dull, irregular rhythm accompanied by muffled laughter and voices. Clara had woken Finn and ordered him to climb into a cupboard and stay silent. She herself had taken the rusty iron pipe she had found in the cellar of the healing house. Her heart raced, her hands trembled, but she knew she had to be strong, because Finn was crouched behind her in the cupboard, and she alone stood between him and those men. She remembered the men's faces when they broke open the door to their room. There had been 3 of them, their clothes ragged, their eyes hollow and filled with a dark, hungry energy. They did not say much, and they did not have to say much for Clara to understand what they wanted. Clara fought, screamed and kicked, swung the iron pipe until her arms burned. But it was not enough. What happened after that remained a black hole in her memory. An empty room made of pain, shame and torn images that she never wanted to enter again. When she came back to herself, the men were gone. Finn had come out of the cupboard, had looked at her with wide eyes and asked whether the creature was gone. And Clara had nodded. She had lied because she could not bear the truth, because she did not want Finn ever to know what had really happened. The days that followed were a blurred, nightmarish whirl of pain and silence. They left the healing house without exchanging a single word about it. Finn spoke only of the creature that had supposedly attacked them, and Clara did not correct him. It was better that way, for him. But the scars remained. Not only the invisible ones carved deep into her, but also those in her behavior. Since that day, she had no longer been the same. She had learned to survive, learned to become hard and unyielding. For Finn. For both of them. Yet there were nights when she saw the men's faces in her dreams, nights when she believed she could feel their hands on her skin again. Now, as she walked through the ruins, she kept Finn in the corner of her eye. He had grown up, had become stronger, and yet to her he remained the boy she had tried to protect back then. The memory was a burden she had to carry alone, and she would keep carrying it as long as it meant Finn would never have to know that weight. Clara. Finn's voice tore her from her thoughts once more. He looked at her with concern, his brow slightly furrowed. Are you sure you are all right? She forced herself to smile, one of those smiles she had perfected to hide the darkness inside her. Yes, Finn. Everything is fine. I am only tired. Finn nodded, apparently reassured, and looked away. Yet Clara felt the cold of the memory gnawing at her. She knew she would never truly be all right. But she had to be, for Finn, always for Finn, because she did not know who she would still be if she let go of that task as well. The room was dark, apart from the dim glow of a fire burning in an improvised iron barrel. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, where old, rotting lengths of cloth hung to shield the group from curious eyes outside. In the middle of this scene sat the scarred man Garren on an overturned barrel that served as his seat. His face was marked by countless lines, a weave of deep cracks that made every smile seem impossible, and his eyes were sharp but tired. "We were always the remnants," he began, his voice rough and quiet, yet it carried effortlessly through the room. "The ones no one wanted. The ones the fog did not take at once, but marked all the same." Around him sat other figures. A woman with short, roughly cut hair and a deep scar running across her cheek held a knife in her hands, using it to carve absently at wood. Beside her leaned a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and a distrustful gaze that kept darting around the room. The rest of the group consisted of 3 more figures whose faces were hidden behind cloths. "You can spare us the stories, Garren," said the woman with the knife, her voice hard. "We all know why we are here. This is about what happens next." Garren let his gaze move over the group. "Perhaps. But there is something we have to admit to ourselves." He paused, his hands resting heavily on his knees. "The fog is playing with us. It did not take us because it wants to break us. It wants us to become part of it." The others said nothing, but the tension in the room was tangible. Each of them had seen someone swallowed by the fog before, yet the thought of becoming a tool of that darkness themselves was difficult to bear. The woman with the knife, Nara, lifted her gaze from her work. "And what are we supposed to do about that? We have no weapons, no safe hiding places left. What remains?" The gaunt man, Marek, snatched up a half-empty cup of water and drank it in one pull. "Surviving remains. That is what we have done all this time. If the fog wants us to become something, then that only means we still have a choice." "A choice?" Nora's voice sharpened. "What kind of choice? This? Living in the shadows, hiding in holes, hoping we are not the next ones swallowed?" Garren raised a hand to interrupt the growing argument. "Enough. We all know this cannot go on forever. We have heard reports of the group moving through the ruins. They carry something with them, something that draws the fog." The words made the air in the room heavier. Marek's distrustful eyes narrowed. "That sounds like a quick way to get us all killed. Why should we care about them? Perhaps the fog is drawn to them and we remain spared." "Perhaps," Garren admitted, "but perhaps they are also our chance. If they have something that draws the fog, perhaps they can also control it. Or at least hold it back." Nara leaned back, the knife in her hand sliding playfully across her fingers. "Or they will get us all killed because they lead the fog straight to us." Garren looked at her with a gaze that allowed no contradiction. "We have nothing to lose, Nara. Either we find out what this group intends, or we sit here and wait until the fog comes for us. I know which choice I am making." The true nature of the group only became clear in the conversations that followed. Garren spoke of how they had survived so far, not through open confrontation, but through observation and subtle interference. "We are the shadows," he explained. "We do not fight the dark head-on because we know we would lose. Instead, we manipulate. We help from hiding, lead things astray, destroy quietly. And if this group truly stands at the center of the fob's attention, then we must find out why." Marek laughed dryly. "That almost sounds noble. But what if they are not worth risking our lives for?" Garren stood, and the flickering of the fire drew sharp contours across his scarred face. "Then we stop them. If they do something foolish that endangers the rest of us, then it ends there. I will not allow their mistakes to destroy our already small world." The group fell silent. It was clear they would follow Garren, as they always had. They were not here to be heroes. They were here to survive and to prevent the fog from growing any further as best they could. The night settled heavily over the ruins, and the dense fog crept relentlessly through the broken alleys as Garren and his group packed their equipment. Every one of them knew that what they were doing was dangerous, but they had no choice. Nara wrapped a cloth around her neck, pulled it over her scars, and gave Garren a sharp look. "If this goes wrong, we should be prepared to have nothing left, no refuge and no lives." "I know what is at stake," Garren answered calmly, while rolling up a map and slipping it into a pouch on his leather belt. "But we can no longer simply wait. This group is our chance to find answers. Or at least, a direction." Marek, the gaunt man, stood slightly apart and checked the blades he carried in a worn belt sheath. "Or, they are the reason we all die. Remember that, Garren? The fog goes where they go." Garren paused, his eyes narrowing slightly before he answered. "That is exactly why we have to watch them. If they find a way to deal with the fog, we might benefit from it. And if not," his voice grew quieter but cutting, "then we prevent their mistakes from destroying us and everyone else." The others in the group, 3 figures whose faces were hidden behind cloths, remained silent. Yet their movements were quick and determined as they made their final preparations. They knew Garren was their only constant in a world of uncertainty, and even if his plan sounded risky, they had no alternative. "How do we even know their names?" Marek finally asked, his voice rough with skepticism. Nara looked up from her bag and snorted softly. "The small library in the south," Garren said curtly. "The old woman, Lyra. She spoke of a seeker, one who leaves traces behind, and of a man who remains near her as though he were made of shadow. Her descriptions were vague, but the clues she gave fit this group. They gather things, search for answers, and they are the ones setting the fog in motion." "And you trust the stories of an old woman?" Marek sounded dismissive, but Nara raised a hand to stop him. "Lyra may be strange," she said quietly, "but her information has always been precise. If she told us these people matter, then they do." Garren nodded, satisfied by the support. "We do not know everything, but we know enough to find them, and that will have to be enough for now." Garren gave the map one last look, then nodded. "They are moving toward the old city garden. We go ahead and take positions at the edge of the ruins. No direct confrontations. We watch until we know what we are dealing with." The group began to move. Their steps were quiet, trained by years of life in hiding. They knew how to make themselves invisible, how to trick the fog and the things that lurked within it. Nara walked to the front, her knife held tightly in her hand. Marek stayed close behind her, his eyes constantly fixed on the shadows moving in the fog. The path through the ruins was treacherous. The streets that once had been there were overgrown with sharp, distorted plants that had spread unnaturally under the influence of the fog. Garren walked slowly, his gaze moving constantly between the surroundings and the map in his hand. He knew the dangers. Every step could bring them closer to the creatures lurking in the fog, or to one of the traps they themselves had set to keep unwanted intruders away. "There ahead," Nara whispered and stopped abruptly. She pointed to a ledge from which they had a good view of the street below. Garren stepped beside her, his eyes narrowing as he looked into the distance. There, in the weak light of the waning moon, movement could be seen. Shadows darted over the ground, too fast to be natural. "That is them," he said quietly. "The group. Eve and the others." Marek gave a soft snort. "What now? Do we talk to them or keep watching?" Garren thought for a moment. Then he shook his head. Not yet. We watch. They have something with them that draws the fog. If we intervene, we could draw their attention to us. Or worse, the fog's. The group settled onto the ledge, their eyes watchful on the figures in the distance. Garren felt the tension in his chest grow. These people could carry the answers he had been seeking for years, but they could also mean the end. Under cover of darkness, they waited, ready to intervene or to watch as the story took its course. The darkness of the night was dense and merciless, while Garren's group remained on the ledge and observed Eve's group in the distance. The shadows of the mistweaves crept slowly closer, but Garren's people knew how to move unnoticed. Their goal was not direct confrontation. They had to keep the situation under control without their presence being noticed. Eve's group had stopped to rest in a sheltered corner of the ruins. Eve held the child in her arms while Garrick and Kael spoke quietly with one another. Finn and Clara sat a little apart and shared a small meal. Yet even in this relative calm, the tension was visible. The fog had thickened, and the faint rustling and dripping in the distance allowed no one to truly rest. They are inexperienced, Nara murmured, crouching beside Garren and watching the movements of Eve's group closely. If they keep being this careless, they will draw the fog straight to themselves. That is why we are here, Garren answered calmly. His eyes narrowed as he watched Eve soothing the child. They have something we do not understand, and they do not know how to move in the shadows. Our task is to make sure they do not make a mistake that endangers everyone. Marek snorted softly. That sounds as though we are here to hold their hands. I thought we were here to gather information, not save them. Sometimes you have to do one in order to achieve the other, Garren replied, and indicated the scene before them with a brief gesture. Eve and Kael seemed to be discussing a map, but Garrick suddenly stood, his posture tense. A sound broke through the night, dull and heavy. It came from the direction in which the group intended to travel. Everyone held their breath, and Garren could see the sudden fear in the movements of Eve's group. Garrick reached for one of his improvised tools while Kael slowly turned toward the source of the sound. What is that? Nara whispered and reached for her knife. Maybe only the wind, Marek muttered, but his voice did not sound convinced. Garren raised a hand to silence them. He watched as Eve's group hesitated before Garrick took a step forward, apparently ready to investigate the source of the sound. Garren frowned. They will not survive that, he murmured. We have to intervene. How? Nara asked sharply. We cannot show ourselves. If they discover us, everything changes. Subtly, Garren said curtly. He reached into his pocket for a small metallic object, a mechanical device that hummed softly when he activated it. He held it in his hand for a moment before throwing it into the darkness. The device landed with a barely audible click near the source of the sound and began to emit a faint light that spread through the fog like a wave. The sound ceased instantly. The tension in the air eased, and Eve's group seemed to relax slowly. Garrick remained watchful, however, his eyes searching the surroundings while Kael said something quietly to Eve. That was close, Nara murmured, her voice barely audible. She turned to Garren. But we cannot correct their mistakes every time. They must learn how to survive. They will, Garren answered quietly, without taking his eyes off Eve's group. But first we have to make sure they live long enough to learn. The group withdrew quietly, their steps almost soundless. Garren knew this was only the beginning. Eve's group was important, perhaps even decisive. Yet it was also a risk, and it fell to him and his people to make sure that risk did not spiral out of control. The night stretched on, and Garren led his group toward another strategic point from which they could observe the route of Eve's group. Their path led them through ruined alleys and past a tower that stood as a silent witness above the ruins. Nara stopped again and again, listening to the sounds of the surroundings before giving Garren a questioning look. He nodded reassuringly. They had to remain alert, because the fog was never still. A fleeting rustle made Marek stop abruptly. He raised a hand and pointed to a narrow side alley from which the sound had come. Garren stepped to his side, his gaze boring into the darkness.
"Only an animal?"
Nara asked quietly, the knife ready in her hand.
"Perhaps,"
Garren answered, his voice only a breath of caution. Yet something about the movement seemed too fast to him, too deliberate. We keep moving. No needless risks. The group moved quietly through the ruins and merged with the darkness. Garren felt the familiar pressure of responsibility resting on him. They had to survive this night, and Eve's group had to survive it as well, whether they knew it or not.